Hello and welcome to Choose a Phi. Today on the show, we have Nathan Barry, who's the founder and CEO of ConvertKit, which he founded in 2013. And it's an industry leading email service provider. And now, for people who aren't creators, an email service provider is something that we here at Choose a Phi use. And in fact, we just moved over to ConvertKit, which is kind of cool. And we use that to send out our newsletter. So I literally sit down every Monday because I'm a procrastinator and write my newsletter that goes out Tuesday morning. And now I log into ConvertKit and load it up. And it's just a phenomenal, phenomenal piece of software. And what's really cool is Nathan has built this using Phi fundamentals. He's a member of the Phi community, has been for many, many years, and he's built something extraordinary. ConvertKit is really, truly a leader in this industry. And it's remarkable to see how it's grown because I actually was an early customer for my other website, Travel Miles 101, since 2016. So to see this journey and see it as a friend, because I've met Nathan a couple of times, hung out, and he's just a really good guy. And I'm so fascinated to bring this conversation to you to talk about this intersection of really Phi and high level entrepreneurship. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And with that, welcome to Choose That Phi. Nathan, it is so good to see you, my friend. Welcome to Choose That Phi.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been a while since we've hung out in person, so we need to make that happen soon again.
Yeah, for real. It has been way, way too long. And yeah, I'm excited that Choose a Phi is back on ConvertKit. So thank you to your team. And what you guys are building is remarkable. It's amazing to see. I think you've actually purchased a couple of companies recently.
We have.
And you're building something that really helps creators like me. And I think for a long time, I just had said, oh, I'll send out this newsletter every now and again. It's no big deal. But it's really now something that's, I consider the newsletter and the podcast, the two pieces of content that I put out every week. And they're equally as important. So for anybody listening who's not on the newsletter, just get on the newsletter already. It's choosephi.com/subscribe. Like I said, I sit down and I personally write it every Monday. But yeah, so Nathan, long story short is thank you for creating this. And it's really something special. And it has to be pretty wild for you. I mean, this is 10 years now, right?
Yeah, January this year marks 10 years. So the first 2 years were pretty slow going, but then after that, it took off. And there's actually something I realized the other day. Someone was like, hey, you should post a photo on Twitter of like the books of some of your favorite authors. And I like turned around and looked at the shelf behind me and I just looked and started pulling books of authors who use ConvertKit. And then like the stack got taller and taller and taller. And then I was like, this is who I have on the list or like on my bookshelf right behind me. And then I went and bought a few more books. And so I need to post a new photo. But looking at that and being like, okay, this is insane. Who uses ConvertKit?
Yeah, you got a name drop now, obviously. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's not just the content creators like the James Clear and Tim Ferrisses and Susan Cain and others who are like run the biggest newsletters, but then it's expanded, right? And like Arnold Schwarzenegger has a ConvertKit newsletter. Tim McGraw has one. If you go to tombrady.com, it says powered by ConvertKit. You know, like these things where you're like, okay, this has gotten really big. So anyway, all that say, it's a lot of fun to be running this company.
Yeah, that's wild. That is wild. So let's go back to the early years and more your Phi journey. And maybe we'll kind of weave in here how it intersects with the founding of ConvertKit. But I'm just more curious about you personally. When did you find the Phi message? Who did you find first? Give me a sense of that.
Yeah. So first, I grew up in a family where money was pretty scarce, and I watched a lot of conflict around money and just that instability of everything that comes with that. And so I always had this idea of like, okay, I'm going to get really good at making money. And so long as I'm always way better at making money than I am at spending it, there can be this really comfortable margin. I think the first introduction to Phi in general might have been Mr. Money Mustache. He's a good gateway drug to the community.
Yeah. Certainly for those of us of a certain vintage, right? I think when we found Phi.
Somewhere in there, I started following Leif with Physician on Fire. I'm not a doctor, but like the way maybe as like income grew, because at that point, some people were having conversations about, okay, I make $65,000 a year. How do I grind this out and get to my Phi number, right? Or the lean Phi side of it. And I was really interested in the side of increasing income. Like I'm an entrepreneur. I was selling digital products. I remember talking to Chris Gillibo years ago. He's someone who got me into like the blogging and podcasting world. He wrote a great book called The $100 Startup. He's written a bunch of other things too. But he said something, if you're trying to have like build up your savings and have more money, it's much easier to increase your income than it is to decrease your expenses. And I remember thinking like, well, yeah, of course, that's easy for you to say. You're Chris Gillibo. You're, one of the first really successful bloggers. You've got this thriving community. You're like, oh, let me write another book, launch a course, something like that, and increase income. And so I kind of wrote it off at first. And then later, when I actually lived out a lot of that path, like built an audience, sold my first digital products, I was like, oh, he is 100% right. When you learn the skills, it is much easier to increase income. So I always focused on that side. And I think that's why I started to resonate with a lot of the Phi conversations around maybe Fat Fire or some of those other angles. Cause it was like, oh, okay, I'm going to get to like a really healthy income.
Mhm.
And I'm always looking for ways to grow it. But then I'm going to be very conservative with, all of my spending and lifestyle
Right.
and all of
Right.
that.
Right. Right.
So even at this point, well, one thing I realized like what I spend money on, most of what I like to spend money on is like income producing investments.
No kidding. Like what?
For years, it was like, hey, what rental property can I buy? I'm like, okay, is
Nice.
this too much of a stretch to buy that? Did I just spend too much? And you're like, it's a good investment. And like my big splurge was, another short term rental or something like that. I'm like, I think this is going to work out just fine.
Yeah, I think that's okay. Because right. I mean, clearly that's not spending for spending's sake. You're buying an asset that's income producing, right? So
Yeah.
that's funny though. That I guess to even think of that as spending money,
Right.
there's something there actually. Like when I have two little inexpensive rental properties in Georgia. I don't think I ever contemplated that as, oh, I'm spending money. It's just I'm allocating my savings in this manner as opposed to that.
I think I was just excited about it, especially in like I got into short term rentals in maybe 2018 or so. And that took money and savings to get into, like my wife and I live on a small farm in Boise, Idaho. And so we bought this 4.5 acre property. It has our house, it had a little guest house. So I was looking at like, oh, the thing that I most want to spend money on right now is like 10 grand to lightly remodel this little guest house.
Right.
And so that was like, I had savings and was like, that's my fun splurge. So I've always had that angle and I've had to learn the other side of it of the, okay, let me not just forever accumulate money, let me get good at spending money on things I care about as well.
Yeah, that's something I definitely want to dive into because I know the book. Have you read the book Die with Zero by chance by Bill Perkins?
I have. I really like his, and I'm sure you've talked about it on the show, but him talking about how sort of the three currencies in life of time, money or wealth, and health, and how you never have, like most people, never have all three at once. And so,
Right.
yeah, big fan of that framing of how we live our lives.
Yeah. That book was a game changer for me. And I think it's helped me spend money more freely now.
What's a change that you've made after reading that book or a way you operate now that was different from before?
Yeah, it's a great question. Very concretely, was two trips that I've taken recently with my daughters. Because
Mm-hmm.
I think about the intersection of Die with Zero and Tim Urban's The Tail End. I'm sure
Yes.
you've read that, right? So I have a 15-year-old daughter, and using The Tail End, which is by the time your kids are 18, you've spent somewhere in the order of 90 to 95% of all the time you will ever spend with them, which is crazy.
Right.
So you're talking 5% a year. So I'm at 75 plus percent of the time I will ever spend with my older daughter. And I'm now at the point where, okay, what that means is we have summers, we have breaks, but it's still finite, right? And in order to take trips, and she has really become a roller coaster enthusiast. I don't know if you knew that was a thing or not, but she's like all in on roller coasters. So we've taken a couple trips together. We
Nice.
took a trip down to North Carolina and down to Orlando to Universal Studios, which was amazing. And then we also went to, this is not roller coaster related, but we went to a Taylor Swift concert in Pittsburgh, which was amazing. Like the best thing I've ever done.
Yeah, I went opening night of the tour.
You're kidding me.
Yeah, because I'm a big Taylor Swift fan, which my wife teases me for endlessly, but she still comes with me
She
as
came
we,
with you?
yeah, as we make the trip. And I'm like, got to get the tickets. I'm not as big of a fan. Like I have a friend who went to, I think 4 shows so far in the Eras tour, maybe 5. I'm not quite on that level, but yeah, it was just like they say spend money on experiences,
Yeah.
not things. Now I'm good at enjoying both, but spending money on experiences with people you deeply care about, like, oh, this is a fantastic use of money.
Yeah, totally agree. And yeah, like I just took my younger daughter to New York City actually. So we took a little trip. It was kind of like a makeup for me going with my older one to Taylor. But it was great. I mean, we use rewards points because we have them. Why
Oh
not?
yeah.
It would be silly not to. But then we splurged on everything else and we didn't even think about it. We got amazing seats to see Hamilton and it was just incredible. We went to one of those observation decks, the Edge, which has this like see-through platform 1,000 feet down, which is insane. And anyway, long story short is I'm not worried. Like I could care less at this point about the money at the margins,
Right.
right? Because when you make a framework of a life that in my case still doesn't cost that much, or at least is very much under control, then at the margins, who cares? It's like the Ramit thing of the lattes. I mean, who cares? But I think that's also where we are now. And I think there is a continuum of Phi, which kind of goes back to what you were saying about increasing income versus maybe lowering expenses. And I wonder if maybe go all the way back to the Nathan of, hey, I just found Phi. Maybe I'm at the beginning of my journey as an entrepreneur and a creator. How do you think you were then mentally in terms of, okay, I can increase my income? But like you said, Chris Gillibo, like, yeah, it's easy for you, but what I can concretely do now is lower expenses. And I think there is something to that.
Yeah. I always felt like I couldn't afford things. Like I
Mm,
remember friends buying houses, right? So this would have been probably 2010. So the housing market has crashed,
yeah.
is coming up. It's actually fairly cheap then. And I start to have friends who, out of college, all that. Boise was not an expensive market at the time. That has entirely changed.
Yeah.
But, they would buy a house and I'd be like, I wish I could afford that, but I can't. And then realizing like, so I was working as a software designer at the time. I was making 65,000 a year. And I realized based on all the numbers, I was earning as much as they were. I definitely could. But I feel like maybe it was how I was raised or whatever else. I always wanted more margin. I didn't want to push financial goals. So even when I quit my job, I wanted to go independent and build iPhone apps. But I basically always overlapped things. So instead of being like, okay, I'm going to quit and then I go build these iPhone apps, we'll see how it goes. Instead, I spent 9 months or more building these nights and weekends. And then I only quit my job once I had about 3 or 4,000 a month in consistent income. And I'd been saving that income for months. And so I had like $25,000 saved up. So it was always that approach because I always thought about what are these savings going to allow me to do? So yes, I could spend on this thing that's fun or something else, but it was like, oh, this would allow me to quit my job in comfort and without the stress. I watched a lack of money cause a lot of stress, like in my parents' marriage and all of that. And so I always saw like a healthy cushion. And really that's the appeal of Phi. You don't even have to have the retire early part of it. Just financial independence means I'm not worried about this. Like the idea that if a car breaks down, you're like, that's a bummer. And that's it. You're like, that is a disappointment. That might have changed an afternoon, or we might have had to take an Uber or something instead of the original plan, but not like something substantial has to change in our life because of this unexpected $1,000 expense. And so I am just a huge fan of the calm that margin and that financial independence, even on a small scale, that brings. So I have always advocated for that. And that's how I've always lived my life.
Yeah, that is, I think, exactly how I would encapsulate Phi. Exactly that, which is that calm. Because, yeah, like you said, is it a bummer when you have $1,000 expense come up? It's funny. I actually just had one. I haven't mentioned this on the podcast. So we have solar panels, and it wound up, one of them was offline. So I had somebody come out. Squirrels basically attacked my entire solar system. They went after and almost destroyed. I think they destroyed 3 of the cords and they decided to bite into the rest of them. So we now have to get a critter guard to keep these darn things out for $900 and then a
Yep.
couple $100. So it was literally like a $1,300 expense thanks to squirrels. And yeah, that stinks. Obviously, it stinks by any measure. But have I thought of that again in terms of stress? No, of course not, because
Right.
I've saved money. And I think that's the important part about Phi is, and a lot of people ask this, it's easy for us to say as like, quote unquote successful entrepreneurs, right? Like I think a lot of people might write off this conversation as, okay, you guys have made it. It's
Yep.
easy for you to say. But I think the benefits of Phi start from the very beginning, right? For that person who, like you're describing, is living on the edge, which is a significant percentage of Americans. And a couple $100 expense, certainly $1,000 expense, is an existential crisis. Well, when they have $5,000 saved up because they've been following the path to Phi for maybe a year or two, I mean, life is so much less stressful. And like you said, calm, the perfect
Yep.
word, calm.
Well, I think so. We talked about the two sides of the equation, right? Increasing income and decreasing expenses. if you're right on that razor's edge, it's hard to have margin in a different way, right? Margin as far as how you can think and time in order to come up with the things or make the life moves that might increase income. If I'm constantly stressed because there's no margin, then I'm not going to have the time to pursue, maybe the technical certification in my career to be able to hop to the next job or to start the side hustle or whatever else that then is going to give me financial margin. And so it really, like when people end up, running revenue and expenses neck and neck, then until you get that space, you can't even have the brain space to see, okay, what should I do? And like that little distance, like, hey, let's just get a little bit of altitude, zoom out and go, oh, these are the changes that I need to make, because someone like Chris Gillibo is saying, hey, it's easier to increase revenue than decrease expenses. And when you're right there in it, it's just like, no, it's not. Or that's easy for you to say. And then if you can get even just a little bit of space, you'll start to see that path.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you basically followed a similar path to me in terms of not burning the boats. And I wonder if that's how you would advise budding entrepreneurs now, because undoubtedly there are many fledgling entrepreneurs in our audience who are thinking about that side hustle, or maybe they've gotten it started and they just don't know. They hear some advice that, oh, the second you start thinking about a side hustle, you should just drop everything and just go for it. You can't do it. You can't be successful unless you're all in. You hear that caricature, right? Versus maybe you or I, and I did this with my Richmond Savers and Travel Miles 101, which is prove a little business model. Same as you. I was making $1,000 a month, 1,500 something, or $2,000 a month, but it was enough that I had proved the business model in my own mind, and then that was enough to make that leap. So obviously, I'm setting this up as an artificial construct that we're going to pick letter B here. But realistically, people come to you all the time, I'm sure. How do you talk them through that?
Well, the first thing is there's a concept that I first heard from Jason Fried that making money is a skill, just like playing an instrument or something else, right? Or really, it's a combination of 1,000 little skills, right? If I sit down at the piano, I would not expect without years of practice to be able to play something amazing. In the same way, if I sit down to start a business or a side hustle, like you would not expect to just be like, oh, yeah, this is how it's done, right? In music, I need to know music theory. I have to understand timing, right? There's so many things. And in business, it's the same way. Like, do you know how to write? Do you know how to set up a WordPress install? Do you know how, like, even these basics of the internet? If you want to process a payment on the internet, how do you do it? Right? That is a skill that you have to learn. You and I learned that skill a long time ago, but there was a time where we're like, I want to sell this thing. How do I, so many of these things.
And it was so hard back in the day.
Oh yeah. And it's definitely gotten easier.
I remember authorized.net using that for credit card payments and crazy things.
Oh yeah. If anyone's used eJunkie or ClickBank, you've been around a while. But there's two sides of it. One is the question of should you overlap your main thing in your side hustle? I think 9 times out of 10, the answer is yes. There's a few exceptions where maybe you should go all in and all of that. And I ended up doing that with ConvertKit after proving the concept. But the other thing is thinking about, okay, for this new thing that I'm trying to make work, what skills do I need to have? And how could I go about deliberately learning those skills? You'll find a ton of people who started a business that you know them for now, and they had a practice business beforehand. So an example, if you take Pat Flynn from Smart Passive Income, very well known, built a wildly successful business now. His practice business, his gateway into this space was he was teaching how to pass an architecture exam for green building, right? He published his notes, that turned into a thing. And then he did this practice, he learned all of these skills and went, that was interesting. I've made money off of it. Of these 1,000 skills that I need to learn to be an entrepreneur on the internet, I've now learned at least a basic level, 400 or 500 of them maybe. And now I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to dive in and do the business that I actually want to do. If you take another example, James Clear, right? He wrote Atomic Habits. In 2021, he sold the most copies of any book on Amazon for the entire year. So beating out, Goodnight Moon, Michelle Obama, whoever, right?
That's crazy.
The man knows how to sell books and he's a great writer and a great marketer. But he did not start with jamesclear.com. He had a practice business called Passive Panda, and it was his very first blog. And it was where he was learning, this is in 2011 to 2012, he was learning how to write, how to set up a blog, how to rank in Google, how to sell digital products, how to build an email list, all of those things. And then when he had finished with his practice business, I think he built an email list to about 10,000 people, which at the time was a very large email list, actually. Yeah. He said, great. And he just set it aside, started jamesclear.com and started writing about what he actually cared about. And so everyone's like, he came out of nowhere. And it's like, well, yeah, he was deliberately practicing over time. And he identified the skills he needed to learn. And then he set himself up to learn those in a low stakes environment.
Yeah, that's awesome. It is amazing, right? The overnight success that's 10 or 15 years in the making. I know, obviously, my story is not nearly as interesting as James Clear's, but I mean, I had a soccer website in like 2010 where I was literally, this was way before the English Premier League was popular here in the US. Like, I was coding HTML tables of the English Premier League standings for every season in existence up on my computer. I knew nothing about HTML. I had to figure out how to get this table to look nice. And you know what? Honestly, like I'm not a coder by any means, but even just literally this week, I've used those rudimentary HTML skills in ConvertKit. No joke. Like when I was writing my email that just went out this past Tuesday, as we're recording this, the first time I sent one out, I had to add in a little whatever it was, a snippet, and put HTML in. It was great. And like those were skills I picked up 10 years ago that I didn't know that I would ever use again. But
Mhm.
this is, I mean, Nathan, this is the golden age of skill building, right? Like you can learn anything one Google or YouTube search away. It's remarkable.
Yeah. And I think people are always like, oh, what do I do with this extra time? And it's just learn skills,
Yeah.
right? If you're at the point where I'm not a video editor, I will never be. I'm not going to edit my own podcast, my own YouTube videos at this stage. But there's a lot of times that having the YouTube or like the video editing skills that I learned over the years really serves me. All the basic things. I no longer earn a living as a designer, but I am so grateful for many years to learn design skills. Because now when something in my company doesn't look right, I'm like, oh, it's this. Like I can give my
Right.
design team real feedback because I've spent years in that career. So I think all of these different things, I mean, I would just maintain a list of all the different skills you want to learn. And if you're not even sure, like, hey, I want to do a side hustle, but I don't know what it is, list out the skills you'd love to have. And then see if a side hustle comes to mind, like, oh, I could do this. Who cares if it even makes money? But if it's the thing that gets me to learn writing, to learn video editing or something
Yeah.
else,
Yeah.
great. We're going to get that skill, stack it up, and go from there. And then it's pretty, not easy, but it's fairly simple to turn some of those skills and combine them and turn them into an income of some kind.
Yeah, you use the word stack in there. And it's funny because since the very inception of Choose a Vi, we've talked about the talent stack. And this was something we got from author Scott Adams years ago, but I've kind of run with it in the sense that you don't have to be world class at any of those things. Like, are you a world class video editor? No, you're not.
No.
And that's fine. But you have now the ability as the CEO to look at something and say, okay, this either passes my test or doesn't, and can give actionable advice to your team. And that's really, really valuable. And undoubtedly, you probably have hundreds of skills that you're at the 80% or better level. And when you add that skill stack up and you put those side by side, there are very few people in the world that have your precise skill stack. Same with mine. I mean, the random bizarro things of CPA and travel hacker and
Yeah.
podcaster, right? Like it's crazy. And then all these little skills that have been built, like that just doesn't exist. Each of us in our own ways are one of a kind. Many of the people listening to this are one of a kind with that skill stack. And you have to then, like you said, look for, okay, how could I build this into some type of income or side hustle? And you said something that I think might pique the interest of some people, which is like, okay, it's actually pretty easy to do that. But I think for a lot of people, that's the limiting belief that I think catches a lot of people. And it goes back to even what you started the episode with, which is, hey, I think I can raise my income significantly. I'm pretty sure I can always do that. A lot of people don't believe that in their heart of hearts. I love like for you to talk to that person as someone who's been through this from every stage, really as a member of the Phi community.
Yeah. So one thing to make clear, I think it is simple, but not easy. And those are different things. There's a lot of things. This happens in investing, right? Investing is simple unless we make it overly complicated. And so we're out here going, okay, what stock should I pick? How should I, which financial advisor should I hire? You know, okay, I went from 100, I tipped over 6 figures. Now I have 7 figures. Like now, obviously I should change everything. And it's like, no, no, no. It's very simple.
Yeah.
You know, a Vanguard investment fund functions the same way at 100,000 as it does at a million, as it does at 10 million. These things can be simple so long as we don't overcomplicate them. And I think that a lot of these side hustles that you see people, especially in the creator space, they're often quite simple. but they can be very difficult to achieve. So what I mean when I say that it's simple, there's kind of three major components. One is you need to have a skill that you are good at. We'll say at least in the 80th percentile. And maybe we'll go four major components. A skill that you're in the 80th percentile at, some sort of unique perspective, right? Where you're saying, this is the angle that I am coming at it with. Anything where, you're saying, this is who I am, right? I'm teaching travel hacking, but I'm doing it as a single mom of two young kids, right? There's just something where it's not completely vanilla. You're bringing in your experience. Or another thing would be sharing your journey, right? I'm trying to build a software company to 5,000 a month in recurring revenue within 6 months, and I'm sharing my journey. That's like,
And that
okay.
was literally your journey.
Yeah, that is exactly what I
For
did.
everybody listening. And you put that up publicly.
I did. But so that's just a little bit of a twist on it. It says like, okay, this is worth following. The third thing is you need to build the skill of teaching everything you know, of sharing and teaching. Of like, hey, I learned this thing. There's tons of travel hackers out there who learned how to do the basics of travel hacking, and then they just did it and they didn't tell us all. Like that's fairly normal, right? But there's this other step of like learn new thing, implement, and tell people about it, right? And if you can build that skill of teaching, that's kind of the third component. And the fourth is showing up consistently for a long period of time. And most people drop one of those steps. They either, if we kind of work through them, in category number one, a lot of people see what you're doing, what I'm doing, all these creators, and they go, oh, I'm going to jump straight in and I'm going to be a creator like that. But they have no marketable skill. They're not a designer, developer, CPA, copywriter, video editor, something. It's like, you got to have that foundational skill that you're actually good at. Otherwise, honestly, I don't want to hear from you.
Yeah.
It's like, or you got to be going on a really unique journey. So I'd say go and build those practical skills of some kind. I started in design and then I started talking about, marketing and business and on from there. But I'm not like, let me launch in and teach business when it's like, hold on, has this guy sold $1 as an entrepreneur?
Right. The age old, you've made more in selling courses than you made in
Correct.
earning.
Yep. So the second thing of a mistake is on the unique perspective, people usually just make something generic. I see this in people who are trying to make niche sites or they're trying to just rank for search terms or something like that. And all I would say to them is like, breathe some personality into it. Say why you're doing something, who you are, put your photo on the about page, like actually make something happen there. Actually, Pat Flynn has this great talk that he gave at our conference, Craft and Commerce. Oh, it's been 2018 or something. And he comes on and he's a really polished speaker. And so he comes up to the center of the stage and he has this backpack that he's famous for. And he gets out his backpack and in his backpack, he pulls out a book and he opens the book and he starts reading it. And it's a children's book and it's called Llama Llama Red Pajama, which I have read to my kids.
Yep. Very familiar.
You're like, maybe even a little too familiar now. He's reading this book and everyone's like, what is going on? First, he's got everyone's attention like perfectly because that is not what they expected. Like, business guru Pat Flynn to open with. So has 100% attention from the audience. And so what he does is he finishes reading the entire book. And first, as a speaker, I love that he reads the entire book because he could have made his point, but he like drags it out. So he's like built all this suspense. Like, where is he going with this? And then he finishes that and says like, like, oh, thanks for listening. Like some nice thing that you might say to your kid or, like one step removed from like, and have a good night.
It would have been awesome if he mic dropped and walk off the stage.
And that's it. Yeah. But then what he does is he plays this video of, I believe it's Ludacris on a LA radio station really rapping the same book.
Huh.
And it sounds completely different. He's got a beat down and it's something they're just doing like spur of the moment. And Pat's point is that this is the exact same content, right? You could read the same content to your kids in a bedtime story on stage to 300 entrepreneurs, and that's going to have one feel. Or like, here's Ludacris rapping the same content.
Yeah.
Right. And so what he leaves everyone with is there are no unique messages. Like it's all been said before. If we're a CPA giving tax advice, like, look, it's all been said before. We've written endless articles about Phi. We've, all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
It's all been said before. So he says there are no unique messages, only unique messengers.
Yeah.
And so finding that angle, what is your unique way? And I think that often just comes down to having your own, like sharing what's unique about your story, why you do things, and then what's unique about your journey and destination. where are you actually going? Right? If you're saying, hey, I am a new software designer and I am teaching everything I know along the journey, and my goal is to get a job at Apple, right? So I'm going to learn everything I can and I'm
Yeah.
trying to get a job at Apple. And who knows if that will take me 2 years or 10 years, but that's the mission that I'm on. Follow along and learn with me, right? I would do that. I would hit subscribe on that newsletter
Yeah, for sure.
because it's not like, here's one of 100 sites where you can learn design. It's like, oh, this person, like I'm connecting with them and their goal, and they're also teaching me. And then, yeah, there's so many things in that, but that's the angle that I take.
Yeah, I love that. So right, it's there are 100 sites. There are probably 10,000 sites
Yeah.
teaching design, but they're all those nameless, faceless,
Right.
just brands. And I think we figure out real quick, you don't want to follow a brand. You want to follow a person. And just having that unique perspective, I did that with Travel Miles 101. It was, hey, we are regular family guys, in our case, the two of us who founded it, who are looking to take our families on 1 to 2 nearly free vacations a year. That was it. We're not 22-year-olds flying around in Singapore suites or in first class, right? Like that's great. And that's great for many people, but that's not great for us and the millions of families like ours, right? You're not going to get advice that's perfectly optimal. And for someone who maybe has endless amounts of time, you're going to get advice that's practical for you. And I think that's really valuable, right? And like you're saying, another way is build in public. Like that example of the person who's going to get a job at Apple, or frankly, you building in public and just being radically honest about, hey, here's the money that ConvertKit's making. And you had, like you said, a very modest goal at the beginning. And it sounds almost like a Phi goal. Hey, we need to make X number of dollars per month. And the way my mind went was, okay, this is enough to cover my lifestyle then.
Yeah.
And that's the goal.
Actually, where that $5,000 number comes from, that exactly covered my lifestyle.
No kidding.
Right. I made $60,000 a year as a software designer before, right? That's $5,000 a month.
Yeah.
And that would 100% cover it. And the reason that I wanted, I think I've talked about this on a podcast before. My wife and I wanted to start a coffee shop. And I knew that a coffee shop is a terrible business.
Yes.
And so you shouldn't do that. And so I thought, like, as a young married couple, this is something that we're going to embark on. And like, this could cause us a huge amount of stress. And so what if I could get one of my digital ventures to be at the point where it covered all of our expenses, and then the coffee shop just had to support itself. It didn't have to support itself and us.
Right.
And then maybe we could like embark on this dream without it causing all of this stress or whatever else. We later decided we didn't want to start a coffee shop. We wanted to get a farm instead, and we did all of that. But that was kind of the thing, like a specific goal, and then tying the financials to it in a way that would get us stability and let us build and grow and experiment without the same pressure of like, this has to work. Otherwise, we don't have a place to live, or otherwise, we don't have these other things.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's the intersection of risk and something you said before, which I wrote down is, what are these savings going to allow me to do?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, how important is that? And this would be an example. We're not talking specifically savings necessarily, but okay, if I have this income stream coming in, well, then my coffee shop, my fictional coffee shop, doesn't have to earn a $5,000 a month profit. It has to simply break even.
Right.
Right. And that's a whole different,
Yeah.
a whole different thing when you have to just break even on a coffee shop. That's probably doable, maybe. But again, what are these savings going to allow me to do? And I'd love for you to dive into that a little bit more, because it sounds like just the way that rolled off your tongue before, it sounds like that's something you've thought deeply about.
Yeah, because it's all like money is just a means to an end. It is useful. Like I love playing the game of making money. And so it is useful in that sense of this is just fun. Sometimes people are like, if I talk about a bigger goal that I have, they're like, why? Don't you have enough? And it's like, yeah, I have way more than enough. And I have big plans for the money, but also like, this is just fun. And, making money is one of my hobbies. But I think often we set goals and we don't know what that means. Okay, if I get to 5,000 a month in recurring revenue from my business, what does that mean? And if you get really specific, it's like, oh, that covers all of our expenses. Or maybe I actually like it when people have a playful relationship with money. I think often we can get too stressed out about it or make perfect decisions or whatever else. When you have good control over both your earnings and your expenses, then like, why not play around with it? And so if you're like, hey, I really want to buy a Tesla Model 3 and that's going to cost this amount, like how quickly with my ability to earn money can I come up with the, however you want to think about it, the $40,000 or something to buy the car or to cover the payment or any of these things, and make it playful and say like, okay, I'm going to get my side hustle to $1,000 or $2,000 a month, and that's going to cover it, and then I'm going to save up in this way. I think it's just really fun to tie those things together and to think about, okay, what is this money going to let me do? And then even make some like, assuming your basics are covered and you're like saving and investing in a good way, then like make some non-optimized decisions where you're saying like, oh, I don't know, I'm not a watch person, but I have friends who are, right?
Sure.
And so, okay, they're going to spend some absurd amount of money on a watch. And it's like, yeah, but I was like playing this game over here that got me the money. And it just makes everything a lot more fun.
Right.
And to tie it back, usually to play that side game, you had to learn a new skill, right? And so, yeah, absolutely. Learn SEO to get rankings, to then get the ad revenue. And that's where you actually won. And the short-term payoff is that you got the watch that you wanted to buy.
Yeah, that's cool. And even down to, again, this skill building, right?
Mhm.
So you talked about short-term rentals, which I assume means Airbnb, though
Yep.
it's not exclusive. But you undoubtedly have many skills from your day job, if you will, that almost certainly helped in marketing your Airbnb. I'm taking a leap here, but some type of even just rudimentary copywriting.
Yeah.
Obviously, you are at a much higher level than rudimentary, but that has to help. Marketing. Are there algorithms to get your short-term rental to show up higher? I suspect most people, and this is the key, it's not even whether you've done this, frankly, but most people wouldn't even know to ask the question,
Right.
whereas you do.
Well, if you've made videos and you've tried to do something on YouTube, you've understood there's an algorithm behind it, right? And that is intuitive to anyone who has spent time in that space. And if you look at Airbnb, you're like, wait, this is a marketplace, just like YouTube.
Yeah.
And you realize every marketplace has an algorithm behind it. And when you've played in 3 or 4 marketplaces, it's super obvious. And you're just asking the question, hey, what are the ranking factors in this algorithm? And you want to know. Like, tell me the rules of the game and I will play it to the best of my ability. But a lot of people don't even realize that there's a game being played. And so once you've played this well in 1 or 2 marketplaces, you realize that the skills carry over to these other ones. And you just immediately walk into something and you're like, it's an algorithm. Just tell me the ranking factors. Let me, read some tutorials and all of that. And I will play the game according to the rules set out. But a lot of people are like, I don't know. I put up a listing on Airbnb. I released a YouTube video. I've got a podcast. Here are the things. I don't know what makes it tick. So I guess I'll just keep creating, which is not bad. When in doubt, just keep creating. That's a good baseline. But yeah, if you've if you've been exposed to marketplaces, then I was gonna say manipulating them. It's not manipulating them. It's just
No.
playing the game according to the rules they set out becomes fairly second nature.
Yeah, agreed. And it is important what you just said a minute ago, which is goes back to number 4 on your list, right? Showing up consistently for a
Yeah.
long period of time. So clearly, that's almost like it is necessary for everything else. You need to create. But yeah, like you're saying, okay, this is the definition of insanity for some people, right? Like if you just keep creating and your podcast is getting the same 7 downloads every time for 500 episodes in a row, well, you probably need to do something additional, right, at that point. But I think clearly, by any definition, producing content consistently, it's essential. And most people, I think a lot of people give up too early. And I suspect you've seen that a lot.
Yeah. The way that I've heard it phrased, and I quote back again and again, is show up every day for 2 years. Because so many people try a new side hustle and they're like, okay, I tried this. Maybe it's a blog, maybe, a YouTube channel, whatever else. I worked super, super hard on it for 3 weekends in a row. Or when I felt energy towards it, I got a bunch done. It's like, that's not going to do it. Like all of these things. To give you an idea, so ConvertKit right now is a business that makes $36 million a year in revenue.
Okay.
2 years in, so I worked on it every single day for 2 years. And at that point, it made $2,000 a month in revenue.
Holy cow. For 2 years of work.
2 straight years,
Wow.
right?
And you did burn the boats, right? You left that was your job at that point?
I was a content creator.
Right. Okay. So you had multiple, let's say, side hustles.
Yep. So I was independent and I'd spent 2 years both being a content creator, writing books and selling courses and all of that on software design, and then also running ConvertKit. And so that's the thing. I made a decision. We talked about burning boats. I didn't burn the boats, but I like shipped them off. I didn't leave them there because I basically said, I cannot effectively do these 2 things at once. And they're both suffering. And so I'm going to stop doing the thing that makes money, which in this case was running my newsletter, writing books on design. I'm going to go all in on ConvertKit. And I'm going to use my savings. In this case, I took $50,000 in savings that I'd built up from before. Again, what will the money buy you?
Yeah.
And a lot of times in my life, the money buys me the ability to invest in the next thing. And so I took that money, put it into ConvertKit. We were at $2,000 a month in revenue. Instead of just working with freelancers, I hired full-time employees who were 100% dedicated. Quick aside, I've got a friend who says, if you're hiring freelancers and you're paying for half of their time, you're getting a quarter of their attention. They'll do the job for you and they'll do it well. But if it's something that you need, like to build a software startup from the ground up, like it needs people all in on it. And so like hiring full-time employees and saying, this is all that you're doing, that really made the difference. Right. And so that was a go all in moment. And in that next year, we grew ConvertKit from $2,000 a month in January to $98,000 a month in revenue 12 months later. And then the year after that was from $98,000 to $500,000 a month. And then it's been up from there.
Yeah.
But it was that you'll see these graphics or memes or whatever else of like the hockey stick or something. It's like most people quit here where there's basically no perceptible improvement. And that was ConvertKit 2 years in. The logical thing to do based on, you say, well, past performance is not an indicator of future success.
Yeah.
Like looking at past performance, the logical thing would be to shut down the business. But I felt like there were things that I hadn't tried yet, you could still iterate on. And then that ended up scaling. So even the show up every day for 2 years,
Yeah.
had I quit at the 2-year mark, I would not have the business that I have today.
Wow. And that would have been perfectly defensible, right?
Yeah,
I mean, by
100%.
any measure, anybody you talk to would have said, okay, yeah, you gave it the old college try, more than that,
Yep.
right? And it didn't work out. That's amazing. So, right, you went from like a $24,000 annual run rate to a 1.2 million or thereabouts.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, was 2016 the year of inflection or 2015?
2015.
2015. Okay.
Yep.
That is incredible. Was there any true point of inflection? Like just for, I don't know if this is going to be honestly very helpful for any other entrepreneur. Like, was there one nugget of what?
Interesting. So the 3 things that I did, or 4 things, I went all in with my time. I said, okay, this is all that I do. Next, I chose a specific niche. So we were like email marketing for, people who need email marketing services,
Yeah.
content creators kind of. First, I chose authors. That didn't quite work. The messaging wasn't right. It was getting a lot of beginners. And then later, after a month or 2, I shifted it to professional bloggers. So I said, we're doing email marketing for professional bloggers. And I got a lot of people back then, and even 2015, being like, can blogging be a profession? And it's like, yes, I can. Look at these. But then there are other people who were saying like, I am a professional blogger. If there's a tool made just for me, like, great, let's go. Then the next thing that I did is a lot of direct sales. Because if you can't list everyone on the internet who needs email marketing services, but you can list every professional blogger, especially if you go in a specific niche. And so what I would do is say, okay, we've got a handful of customers. We had a paleo recipe blog that was really popular. We had a men's fashion blog that was popular. We had like a interval training fitness blog that was popular. And so I basically drew a little circle around each one of those and said, okay, let's expand slightly.
Okay.
Who are 10 other people like this person? And that gave me I could list them out and I could reach out to them with direct sales and say, hey, is there anything frustrating you with MailChimp? And everyone always had frustration with MailChimp.
There's always frustrations.
I had frustrations with MailChimp. That's why I started the company, So it was a good lead in. And then that could turn into sales conversations. And the last thing that I did that made a huge difference is I said, hey, we have a concierge migrations program, which is a really fancy way of saying, I will open up your MailChimp and WordPress and everything on one screen and your new ConvertKit account on the other. And I will copy it all over for you. I'll FTP into your site and change everything. And it was crazy low revenue work, or like dollar per hour. It was probably $5 an hour because you're spending all this time for a $50 a month account. But what I realized is that every account that I got was making the next sale the tiniest bit easier. And so then that built momentum. And so we ended up going from January at $2,000 a month to April at $5,000 a month. June was $10,000. July was $15,000. September was $25,000. Like you could see it compound because word of mouth really, really kicked in. But it took, do you know the analogy of a flywheel?
I do from you actually, but why don't you, because I literally have your Creator Flywheels article open on my browser right now. Why don't you illuminate everybody? Because this is fantastic and it's something Jonathan and I have been talking about behind the scenes.
Oh yeah. So I love talking about flywheels. And my first exposure to a flywheel was in the country of Lesotho, which is landlocked inside of South Africa. And I was there working with an orphanage and we were installing a well. And so, we drilled this or had this company come in and drill a well. And it's like, okay, what pump do you put on top of it? They don't have reliable electricity there, at least not at the time. And so we didn't want an electric powered pump that would make their source of water go in and out. So the first pump, if you think about, an analog pump would be something you might see at a campsite, right? A long handle coming out, you pump it up and down. Every time you pump, you get a spurt of water. If you keep the pumping going, then you'll get a consistent amount of water. That would be a lot if you're trying to have like 100 kids rely on this thing. And so this engineer that we were with installed a flywheel. And what that is a large metal wheel that sits on top of it. It's really hard to turn at first. Like when we had that going, my friend Luke and I were on either side of it and we're like trying, like we're bracing and leaning into it to get it to turn. And we turn it together. And the first rotation is super slow and hard. And the second rotation is a tiny bit easier and easier and easier. And pretty soon he steps away and I'm spinning it with two hands and then one hand. And then I can keep the momentum going with one finger. And so what it's doing is kind of following these three basic rules that I define for a flywheel. First is that instead of the up and down motion of a traditional hand pump, this is circular. So there's no start and stop to the momentum. The conclusion of one series of tasks or whatever rolls straight into the next. The second thing is that each rotation gets easier with time. And the third law is that each rotation produces more. And if you think about that, laws 2 and 3 combined are pretty fascinating because you're like, wait, I'm going to be putting in less effort over time and getting more results. Like, this is too good to be true. Like, what are you selling me?
Yeah.
But if we go back to my direct sales example for ConvertKit, it was brutal to get those first accounts, right? It was so much work. People are like, who uses this product? Why should I use it? Do you have this feature? And it's like, no, no, no. But if you can convince one person to do it, and you're like, hey, I'll switch your entire site for free. I know a thing or two about email marketing, so I'll like consult and advise on this. And we have this like really difficult turn of the flywheel to get $50 a month in revenue. And so we're making $2 an hour. This is not good. But the flywheel turned. Now, the next time I learned, okay, now here's someone else who uses it. I optimize my systems a little bit. When someone goes, who uses this? I'm like, oh, Joel uses it. And they're like, oh, I know Joel. If it's good enough for him, it's probably good enough for me. And so it gets a tiny bit easier. And pretty soon, right, each rotation of the flywheel is producing more and more. And that's what we did. And I've seen this play out across so many different businesses over time. We get into a ton of creative examples or whatever else. But these flywheels is really how you build something substantial. And the most important point from a like show up consistently perspective is that you should expect it to be very difficult at first. Getting the business off the ground to get meaningful results is like you and your friend braced against the flywheel trying to get it to turn that one time. And that should not be the sign of like, well, this isn't for me. See ya. It should be like, yeah, that's the way these things work. And you got to stick with it and build momentum.
Yeah, I love that visual. And it really, like you said in there, this is compounding. I mean, those of us in the Phi
It's
community.
leverage and compounding, really. We're just using different terms to describe it.
Exactly. But yeah, the visual makes it great because, right, we can all picture, okay, just looking at a compound interest calculator or like literally the doubling of the penny or whatever. Or, hey, if you're getting 10% on $1,000, well, it starts slow, but then you start seeing that 10% using the rule of 72. I mean, this is going to double. And then it's, okay, it's 2,000, it's 4,000, it's 8,000, 16, 32, boom. That is the example of this, right? And it's so funny because I think I heard you on another podcast talking about examples. Like you said, you have tons of these creator examples. I think you were mentioning the podcaster Lewis Howes, and I might have it wrong, but how he reads a review at the beginning of every episode, right? And it's funny because Jonathan and I used to do that at the end of each episode. We used to give away for the review of the week. We gave away a free T-shirt, and I mean, frankly, like we have almost 5,000 five-star reviews on Apple Podcasts. And obviously the podcasts have been around for a while. It's been really successful. It's not like orders of magnitude out of the ordinary, but that's certainly more reviews than we would have gotten. And it really helped. And I mean, honestly, Nathan, we went away from doing that because it was kind of a hassle to give out the T-shirt and blah, blah, blah. And then, like, you can always come up with an excuse. But I heard you say that recently. I'm like, well, damn. I need to go back to like that's an example of a flywheel that I literally worked for me and I went away from for no reason whatsoever.
Mm. There's so many things that we do where we find something that works. And then when we do that, we go, wow, that's amazing. I'm so glad I came up with that thing that worked. What else could I find that
Yeah.
works?
Yeah.
And you're like, maybe the thing that worked. I've done this so many times in ConvertKit's growth that we don't even have time to get into all the examples of that. But it's pretty common to fall into that trap. But yeah, and using the reviews flywheel as an example, our goal is to get listeners for the podcast. We understand that a contributing factor in the podcast ranking algorithm, right? Because we're playing in a marketplace, is reviews and listeners. And so we need to get more reviews. How do we do that? Okay. Well, first I need to talk about it and ask for reviews, right? So that's the start of our flywheel. I'm telling people where to go to offer the review. The fact that when they leave a review, that's going to help me in the algorithm, which is going to help me get more listeners. Then when those listeners are listening to the show, then I'm saying, hey, write a review. And here's a review from, Joe in Indiana, right? And so someone goes, I'd like to be the next Joe in Indiana and get a shout out on my favorite podcast. So maybe I'll write a review. So you have this true flywheel where it completes the loop, where reviews get listeners, listeners get more reviews, and reviews get more listeners. And so you're just going around and around. And this flywheel, I'm trying to think, is it getting easier with time? It's definitely producing more with time, right? Because you're having even more reviews to choose from. More listeners to the show makes getting guests on the show, like it contributes to a lot of different factors.
Right. I think the holistic flywheel gets easier, not the actual review flywheel,
Right.
but that's not what you're going for, right?
No, but it could be like when you first do it, you might be like, and our review of the week is the only review that we
Right.
got
This
this week.
1-star review.
Which you might call it out, right? That would also be entertaining if you're like, and Joe from Indiana said this show is a complete waste of time. And so if you agree with me,
The host is an idiot who says
yeah,
and ah a lot. Definitely gotten one or two of those.
yeah. But yeah, it makes the entire thing flow more easily. So yeah, once you understand the concept of flywheels and you start to look for them everywhere, even in your own task list, like what are the things that I do as a scattered set of tasks? Or what are the things that I am pretty good at aligning into a linear set of tasks where I'm like, hey, I'm producing a podcast and these are the steps that I do for every podcast. And then what would have to be true for me to complete that and tie the two ends together and put it into a loop where it flows one into the next and gets easier with time. And that's really where it comes into a flywheel.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, it has been a game changer for me in the way I think about it because honestly, I haven't been that focused on growth. I'm doing my thing here, I'm producing content. But when you're creating something and you're creating something that resonates with people, when you actually think about it, you're doing a disservice to the community and I mean, in a grandiose way, the world at large by not trying to spread the message. And I think that flywheel concept is great. So I'm going to take a little pause here and say, okay, I want to reinstitute this, right? I mean, I'm talking to you. You use this example. I realize I'm not doing it. Let's start again. So we're going to start up the review thing again. From here on, I'm going to do a review of the week. Each podcast, obviously, we're recording this a little bit in advance. So I'll try to get this going in quick order. But we're also going to double it into the way that you send it to me is you send a screenshot of your review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and you need to be on my newsletter. So choosefy.com/subscribe and just hit reply every single week. When you hit reply to that, it comes to me. I read every single one of these. Send me a screenshot of the review, and I'm going to pick one of them a week, and we're going to read it on the podcast. So I think, Nathan, does that count as a double? I don't know if we'll call them flywheels per se, but I think that's the kind of thinking that people need to really institute. Okay, I really want people on this newsletter because I think it's useful.
Right.
And I'm creating something that I think is really valuable. And I wish I could get more people on the newsletter.
Yeah. And so one addition that I would make to that flywheel is I would then put an automated email in your newsletter that
Yeah.
makes sure that they're subscribed on the channels you care about, right? YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, etc., and ask them to write a review. Right. So now I can hit it from two sides. I'm on the podcast saying, hey, go and subscribe. You're like, oh, right. So someone does that, but then maybe they forget to write a review. Or I'm listening in the car while I'm driving. And it's like, oh yeah, I'm totally going to write a review. Maybe they remember step one of like, go subscribe, but then they don't write a review. Well, guess what? A couple days later, there's an email that shows up automatically. It's like, here's a link to click directly to write a review. So like, here we go. We're getting podcast listeners, we're getting reviews, we're getting subscribers, and we're hitting it from all sides and everybody's happy.
I love it. I love it. And I think For me, one of the cardinal rules of business is cutting down on friction.
Yes.
That's what I call it, right? Especially online business, cut down on friction. You think about how much friction there is between listening to a podcast and getting somebody to take any action on a computer. It's really hard. There's so much friction. But if you send an email, they're sitting at their phone or at their laptop. There's a lot less friction, especially if you give them the link to here's where you go and give a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And it's just there, right? It's just you've served it up for them and you've cut friction. And the reason why we're kind of, in a funny sense, talking so in depth about Choose a Phi here is like, this is really valuable. These lessons are really valuable for anybody who's starting an online business or any type of business. It's how do you make this easier? How do you cut friction? Because honestly, people are really busy. You think about your business all the time and you think people live and breathe it. They don't. I'm here to tell you they absolutely do not. They don't think about you except when you make it easy for them and you provide them great content and you make their lives easier, right? And when you can do that, okay, people do want to go to bat for you, but they don't want to they have to find it. Like what I just did, right, Nathan? I just said, okay, go leave a review, but I didn't give you any instructions. So what about if we set up at chooseafy.com/review?
Right.
And I'll give exact instructions. We'll have this by the time this goes live. There'll be exact instructions on how to leave a review at multiple different places with the exact links, maybe some screenshots, etc. Well, that makes it a lot easier. Somebody can remember that. We'll even set it up so it's both /review and /reviews, because that's another one of my cardinal rules is don't make it plural if it's singular. And oh God, like, because people can't remember that. But now you can remember either of them, /review or /reviews. Like those are the kind of things as a content creator you need to be thinking about.
That's really good, because something else with these flywheels that you can do is take a step back and look, how are you going to improve it with every rotation? How are you going to make it turn more easily? And we haven't even gone through a rotation of the flywheel fully when you just made some pretty meaningful improvements to it that anyone could adopt, where you're right, that is a messy place, to give instructions to, but you can give someone such a crisp URL and optimize that. So that's the kind of thing. Someone might say, hey, I'm going to implement the reviews flywheel. I've got it going, and maybe their pitch isn't that great. Maybe there's no reward. There's some of these things, but they started and they did it with those first few reviews. And then each cycle, they're like, oh, right. Brad said I should have a reviews page. Okay, done. I'm going to implement that the next iteration. Okay, after this, I've tested different giveaways. Is it just the reading of the review? Should I offer a t-shirt? Like, let's try different things and see. Maybe we track it. Hey, reviews per week. And I'm monitoring this and I'm seeing, okay, which incentive gets more reviews. And you don't have to get it all right the first time. You can start with the very simple, like lumpy version of the flywheel, and then it gets polished and spins faster and faster and then drives more results.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Yeah, the flywheel concept, it's so important. And also just testing, but not getting caught up in that analysis paralysis. I think so many people think it has to be perfect the first time. It doesn't. We're both saying it absolutely does not. It can't be. It won't be. You will look back on what you created a year ago, not less 5 years ago, obviously, and probably be somewhat embarrassed about it. And that's fine. It's fine. You get better. That's part of the game here. So super important. But Nathan, I wanted to go back to something we were talking about before. So two things. And one of the worst things you can do as a podcaster is ask two questions, but I'm going to set up both of them and then we'll start with one. So you said, I have big plans for the money. Now you're talking about, obviously you have a significant net worth. It's tied up. A lot of it, I assume, and we don't have to get into the details, but a lot of it, I assume, is into the ownership of ConvertKit, which is most likely illiquid unless you've somehow sold off some percentage. But at some point, that will be liquid money, I assume. So big plans for the money. And then we also talked before, and you asked me about, hey, what have you been doing differently since you read Die with Zero? And I didn't double back and ask you. And let's start there.
Okay. Oh, there's so many things. So first, happy to talk about the liquid, illiquid aspect of it. ConvertKit has a private market valuation of over $200 million. So it's substantial. The SaaS valuations in the SaaS world have come down a bit from the craziness that they were, but they're still amazing compared to other businesses. So I'm like left with this problem of kind of an interesting dynamic of at one point of like a liquid net worth of about 2 million and an illiquid net worth of like 150, which is a little lopsided maybe in our portfolio.
So
if someone had that, it was like, hey, I've got 99% of my money in Apple stock and then 1% over here in cash. Is that good? You'd be like, maybe let's rebalance slightly. it's not quite the same when it's your own company, and there's a lot of factors in that. But one thing that I did is I ended up putting together a secondary round where our team members who all have shares in the company can sell stock. And I wasn't going to participate in it because I felt like I had enough liquid net worth. I liked the rate that it was growing, how I was
Sure.
getting cash out of the business, what the other investments, the Airbnb portfolio was doing and all of that. But then I thought a lot about time value of money might be a too generic way to think about it, but that, okay, if I sell some ConvertKit stock now in the secondary sale, it's available. It's basically a bunch of longtime friends of ConvertKit who are like, hey, if any of your team members ever want to sell, we'll happily buy it.
Interesting.
So I thought, okay, if I participate in this, say I sell $1 million worth of stock and I get this windfall, what would I do with it? How would it change my life? And my wife and I talked it over and we're like, it actually wouldn't be that. Like there isn't something that we want to change. We already have our farm, which is our dream property. We bought it for $520,000. Years later, it's probably worth about $1 million. Like it costs a decent amount to operate, but like we're pretty DIY type people and all of that. So there wasn't something that there'd be a substantial change on of getting the money now versus say in 3 years or 5 years from now. But going to the Die with Zero book, I thought about my parents. And for me, having the money at age 30 versus 35 versus 40 didn't feel like that big of a difference. But for my parents and my wife's parents, it seemed like a pretty big difference. Like money now was a big factor. My parents had divorced and remarried, and then my wife's parents were still together. And so we basically had like six parents, all of whom were in various stages of like very close to retirement, just work for 2 or 3 more years to like, I'm not sure what the retirement picture is going to be like,
Okay.
and you basically get that whole spectrum. And what I realized is that that would be hugely valuable to be able to push all of them over into retirement now, not like 3 years from now or something else, but like today that matters. And so what we ended up doing is selling about $2 million worth of stock.
Okay.
That was 1% of the company, and finding things to invest in. I bought a couple more properties, put more money into index funds and all of that, and set that up where it was then a retirement fund for all of them paying out. I just used the gift tax rules.
Huh.
So I didn't even use my lifetime exemption.
Okay.
At the time, it was $16,000 per person per year that you could donate or gift.
Yeah.
And so my wife and I combined to a couple, then results in whatever the math is, 70 some thousand.
Yeah, it's 4 times that.
Yeah.
In essence, right? Because a lot of people, let's just slow down on this because a lot of people don't know this. So, right, each year you're allowed to gift $17,000 per person in 2023. And usually each year it's kind of indexed a little bit. It often goes up maybe $500 or $1,000 thereabouts.
Yeah, it gradually climbs. So what that means is that, let's take my wife's parents, for example, right? I can give my father-in-law $17,000 and my mother-in-law $17,000. My wife can give her father $17,000 and her mother $17,000. So people look at it like, oh, $17,000, that's not that much. But when you go times 4, that's substantial. And so it wasn't like enough that it covered all of their living expenses or that sort of thing. But basically what happened is at the end of one tax year, when we did this, we gifted, roughly $70,000 per couple.
Yeah.
And then we tipped over into the next tax year, like 2 months later, and gifted another 70,000. And then what we just said is, hey, every January you're going to get this, like whatever that limit is, you're going to get this and you can count on it forever. I have the investment set up.
Wow.
Like I set up the fire plan for you.
Yeah.
And that was worth it. That was amazing. And so my stepmom decided to still work as a nurse. She really enjoys her job and like wants to contribute towards her retirement goals and all that. So it wasn't quite enough that it like tipped everybody over fully into retirement. But my father-in-law left his job immediately. Sorry, I actually get emotional thinking about this, and I'll explain in a second why. But he left his job immediately rather than staying the additional 2 to 3 years that he planned to. And he absolutely loves it. Like happiest retired person you'll ever meet.
Amazing.
And then the thing is, my mom and my stepdad had a lot of things, like a lot of struggles with money and that sort of thing. And my stepdad had a lot of health issues. And I think what happens is we always think we have all kinds of time. And you think about that in the intersection between time, money, and health, right? And what we learned a few months later is that he was out of health. And so he ended up actually passing away 6 months later.
Okay.
And he passed away knowing that my mom was 100% taken care of. Yeah, and I can't think of anything better to have spent the money on.
Oh man.
And so, like, in the grand scheme of things, like, on one hand, it's a lot of money. On the other hand, it's not that much money.
Yeah.
And from a die with zero perspective, like, uh, yeah, it's the best money
Yeah.
I've ever spent.
Oh man. I have chills. I mean, Nathan, that is extraordinary. I mean, the gift, truly a gift on every level.
Yeah.
And the gift of time, right? I mean, think about what you did for the six of them. And
Yeah.
it's just incredible. It is extraordinary. And I mean, honestly, you should be just so proud of yourself because most people are selfish. Let's be honest, right? Like most people wouldn't do that,
Yeah.
you know? Or think about all the what are the signals I'm sending to the team that I'm selling some of
Right.
my, right? Like all this BS. But you know what you did? You did something extraordinary and you changed people's lives.
Hmm.
You should be just so proud of yourself, man. That's incredible. And obviously, I'm sorry for the loss, but goodness, what peace of mind you gave him.
Right. Going all the way back to the beginning of this episode, we're talking about like, what can you buy with money? And again, when someone says, like, why are you trying to earn more? Don't you have enough? Like, why are you taking another sponsor on a podcast? Or why are who knows what, right? Maybe you're launching a course or anything. Jumping from one job that's good to another job that pays 25,000 or more. Like, why aren't you content? What's your problem?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what can you do with this money? Like, you can have a huge impact. And not even mentioning like the personal growth or the new opportunity, the new challenges. And so that's stuff that I really, really enjoy. Now, you had another part of your question, which is like, what have I spent money on?
Yeah, just the fun stuff. If there's anything that jumps to mind, I don't think anything can top that answer, obviously. But
Yeah.
regretting all my choices, asking two questions at once.
There's a couple things. We ended up buying the property next door to us, which is ours is 4.5 acres. It's another 4.5 acres. Like, rented out the house as an Airbnb. And so it pays for itself. But, it costs a lot to remodel it and get it going and all of that. So that was one of my favorite purchases.
Nice.
Partially, even just not even having the land, like the other property borders a major road. And so we built this giant berm all the way down.
Oh
And
my
so I don't hear
goodness,
the road anymore.
that's amazing.
And like, great use of money. My
Wow.
kids, they wouldn't have gone over near the road anyway because it's like another property in between. But still, like,
Sure.
just that little thing of like, there's not a 5-lane road that anyone's gonna go near. So that's a fun one. Another one, the VIP access at Disneyland.
Oh, tell me about this. I've heard about it.
So basically, it's expensive. I think it's like $4,000 in addition to your Disneyland tickets, right? So it adds up. But then they give you a private tour guide. You can take up to 10 people total.
Wow.
I'm actually taking. We have a team retreat in a couple weeks near Disneyland, and some team members are staying afterwards. And so I'm taking a bunch from the team who want to go, and it'll be fun. But then you just skip all the lines. That's
Oh my
really that.
goodness.
People are like, "What's the advantage?" Like, it gets you all this, and like, there's other things, but ultimately you skip all the lines.
Oh, that's so cool.
It's great fun.
Yeah, that is money well spent. I've never done that to that degree, obviously. But again, my daughter is this roller coaster enthusiast. And I mean, the fast pass or things like
Yeah.
that, like each park has their own name for it. But in essence, you're cutting probably 90 to 99% of the line, depending on the ride and the park and such.
Yeah. So it's basically like, imagine having a fast pass or better to every single
Yeah.
ride. Like, some of them you end up in the fast pass line, others they take you in through the exit. So you just
Yep.
don't even wait at all. It just kind of depends on the ride. But yeah, it's pretty fun. So those like experiences things I love. And the last one would probably be sailing trips.
Oh,
I took a sailing class a couple years ago and can now captain, a sailboat. And so, like, trips in the British Virgin Islands, like my family and another friend's family for a week on a 45-foot catamaran, like, they're spendy, like we'll spend 15,000 or something. Flights are free when you use the airline miles to get
yeah.
there. We do all our cooking on the boat, but that kind of thing is just incredible.
That is wild. And it's funny. It still is skills when you think about it, right? Like you learned how to sail. You told me before we hit record that you're learning to get your pilot's license now. So I
Yep.
mean, we got air, sea, land here, Nathan, in every way. But I mean, that's awesome. Talk about just a cool thing, and it makes you more interesting.
Yep.
Frankly, like not for nothing, but it makes you more interesting. And
Hey,
not that you're not interesting as
if
it
I'm
is,
going to
but
be a content creator, like, I might as well throw some sailing or some aviation stuff in there.
yeah,
But yeah, we've talked about skills like again and again through this, but I love learning new things, and I will continually spend money on experiences and skill building and all of that. And then I'm going to find a way to combine them all together and have a lot of fun and make more money and have more experiences.
hell yeah, I love it. Yeah, it is amazing, this through line of skills. That's what it comes back to. It comes back to all these things that you've talked about for the last hour and change here is you have to create, you have to try, you have to test, you have
Mhm.
to learn things, you have to be unique. All of these things are important. You don't, and this is important, you don't have to be the best in the world at something. You don't. You just need to have that unique perspective. You need to be a little bit different. You need to be maybe a step or two ahead, maybe, depending on what your niche is, of the people that you're talking to. They're not looking for the best in the world. They're looking for a story that they can relate to. And if you can be that story, if you can make something interesting, you can create content, you can create a business, you can do anything. And it's amazing. I mean, Nathan, we're living in a golden age of this.
Yeah, we are. That's so fun. Dude, thank you for having me on the show. I think this is some of the most fun I've had on a podcast episode in a long time. And I do a
Nice.
lot of these. So
Oh, that's so cool. I'm
it's
so
been
glad.
good.
That's really kind of you. That is incredibly, incredibly kind. Yeah, this is, I mean, what a great conversation, right? That's what's fun about just connecting. And I think that's what I try to do with all of our guests, right? It's regardless of, obviously I've met you a couple of times, we've hung out, but we haven't talked in 4 or 5 years, right?
Yep.
It's not like we're like long lost friends, but it's just when you have conversations, when you dive in, when you're interested, when you ask interesting questions, like this goes back to what we've been talking about also, is like it's fun to connect with people. And I
Mhm.
think a lot of us maybe lost sight of that over the last couple of years. It's obviously been a tough couple of years, and I'm really like just fortunate and blessed to be able to do this on the podcast with interesting people that I want to talk to. It's great.
Yep. I love it.
Awesome. Well, my friend, thank you again for coming on. So convertkit.com is where everybody, if you're an aspiring content creator, this is what I use now. Again, for all three of my sites, I'm moving my third one over today. I just emailed one of your colleagues. So it's phenomenal, truly phenomenal. But Nathan, if people want to reach out to you, is there a best place, Twitter, something like that?
Yeah, I'm most active on Twitter. So just Nathan Barry, and Barry is Barry. And then my newsletter, I write every Tuesday about these random topics. So nathanbarry.com, and you can subscribe right on the homepage and, get all my musings about basically everything we talked about today, from like money to flywheels to content creation to whatever I happen to find interesting that week.
Heck yeah. And I am looking at my newsletter in my inbox from yesterday. So I am certainly on your on your email newsletter list. And
Perfect.
yeah, so Nathan Barry at Twitter and nathanbarry.com. Awesome. Again, thanks, buddy. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me.